for coming, everyone. Happy that you're all here. So, this is our first speaker event of the year. We are the Haverford Free Thinkers. My name is Alex. I'm a junior here at Haverford, one of the co-founders. And this is my other co-founder, Matthew, also a junior, and Joe, another junior. There's kind of a trend here. So how this is going to work is our first speaker is going to be Hugh, and he's going to speak for roughly an hour. Well, he's going to use the time as he pleases. And then we're going to break up around 4:15-ish, 4:20-ish to get some refreshments, stretch our legs, etc., etc. And then Ali is going to speak for the remainder of the time to also use as he pleases. So our first speaker, Hugh Taft-Morales, is the president of the Philadelphia and Baltimore Ethical Society. So please join me in welcoming him.
President is too highfalutin term.
Leader, I apologize.
Well, it's leader, which is even worse. But I'll explain why in a minute. So what I thought I'd do. Hi. Why don't we just go around and say names so I can try to remember them. It won't be promising.
My name is Teresa Jimenez.
Teresa.
Yeah. Rolando Gutierrez.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
How do you spell that?
K-A-R-A.
Thank you.
I'm Matthew.
Right.
I'm Alex.
Yeah.
Divesh.
Yeah. Help me out.
D-I-V-E-S-H.
Thank you.
I'm Alessandro.
I love that.
I could have said Rolando.
Rolando. That gets credit.
And I'm Christian.
So my name's Hugh, and what I thought I'd do is talk about where I'm coming from, why I'm wearing a coat and tie, what I do, and then the topic that Alex and Joe asked me to talk about is humanist spirituality. And it's a pretty commonsensical approach. It's not, it doesn't have the philosophical rigor necessarily the second speaker will have, although I can't predict, but I serve basically as a humanist clergy person. The Ethical Society was founded 140-odd years ago by the son of a reformed rabbi in Manhattan. He was at Temple Emmanuel, which was the leading reformed temple in the United States. The person who founded Ethical Culture, his name is Felix Adler. His father, Samuel, came from Europe when the reformed movement was really burgeoning in Central Europe, but at the same time there was a lot of political instability at the time. And there were labor movements that he was supporting, as well as reforms within Judaism. Samuel Adler, for example, took down the wall between men and women in the congregation. He questioned kosher habits, saying they might have been useful at some point, but they're no longer really useful as far as health is concerned. He questioned various, there are lots of rules in Judaism, he questioned many of them. But he also questioned the government, and in Germany at that point, the labor movement was a threat. So there was an autocratic counter-revolution. Samuel decided to move his family to the United States because of danger to his family. In fact, Samuel's brother was jailed for his labor activism. So he brought his son, who was 7 years old, to the United States in 1857, grew up in the United States within the Reform movement. And if you know Reform Judaism, the major, in some ways, revolutionary tenets is that the focus of Reform Judaism was on healing a broken world. It was not so much focusing on keeping the tribe of Israel alive, but it was much more on going out into the world. If you know the distinction between Mahayana and Hinayana Buddhism, it's much more Mahayana. It's the greater vehicle. It's being engaged in the way you earn God's favor in life is by doing good for others. So he was raised in that tradition. He went to great schools, was raised in a very learned household. His mother, who worked with the temple, took him to many places in New York that served charitable purposes, children's orphanages, soup kitchens, and so on. There was no social welfare net in the United States at the time. All charities were basically out of religious institutions. And he was being groomed to be the next rabbi of Temple Emmanuel. when he was sent to Europe to study Kant, as all Reformed rabbis sent their children to get their PhD, come back certified, basically, to go into rabbinical training. But he came back and he gave a speech at the temple. It was called The Judaism of the Future, which I think it's important that he didn't call it the future of Judaism, because that would have implied more of a continuity. It was Judaism of the future, how different it's going to be. And in it, he didn't mention God. And after the talk, the associate rabbis and members of the board of the temple came up to him and they loved the talk. It was very intellectual. But they said he didn't mention God. And they said, "You do believe in God, don't you?" And he answered, "Yes, but not your God," which ended his tryout to be the next rabbi. But he broke from the temple on positive terms and founded what he believed was going to be the future religious movement, which was called ethical culture. He gave a speech at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. It was its founding speech, where probably a third of the people who attended were people from the synagogue. He chose to do the services for this new religious group, which was going to be on Sunday. I think in part politically, not to compete with the temple. But about a third of the community was Jewish, about a third was Unitarian, and about a third came out of the free thought movement, which if you study Bennett's The Freethinker Journal, there was a group of people surrounding people like, Ingersoll, the great agnostic, for example, who were actively trying to carve out a space for religious discussion that was based in free thought. So it was still religiously oriented, but it was based on freedom of conscience, trying to counter dogma. This group of people basically wanted to follow Adler's idea that by founding a movement that is explicitly non-theist, in other words, they don't take a position on whether God exists or not. So it's not advocating atheism. It's a little bit closer to Comte's, if you know his temple, basically a humanist temple. He believed that you had to have a liturgy and cycles which were all based on human saints. So Auguste Comte created this movement in the mid-1800s which had a very similar liturgical calendar, except it used humanist heroes instead of the saints and stories from the Bible. Well, Adler wanted to do that, but even more focused on ethics. So he believed that the United States certainly was in danger of losing its ethical soul, basically. Because if you know American history at the turn of, in the late 1800s, you have the Gilded Age, so people are just making money hand over fist. You have the elimination of Native Americans. You have the re-enslavement of African Americans in Jim Crow systems. You have the degradation of workers who were being crushed left and right. The labor movement was being crushed left and right. Children working in mines and in mills and so forth. So he was afraid that without religion, the Golden Rule would disappear. So he wanted to create a non-dogmatic, non-theistic, congregational movement, because he believed that some place needed to maintain focus on ethics. So ethical culture was started. The New York Society was in 1876. Then they started one in Chicago. Philadelphia was the third, where I serve as humanist clergy. I also serve at the Baltimore Society, and I'm a member of the Washington Society, because that's where I live. I think the most important thing, I grew up totally secular, which is actually, I'd say maybe, I don't know, Christian's a member of the Philly Society. I think less than a third of the members of ethical culture grew up secular. They were in religions, got disillusioned, and came to ethical culture. They were already comfortable with the form of religion, meeting weekly, having a service where there is music. We pass a collection plate. It almost feels like a Episcopal service. You know the format of that. And the center of it is a talk, however. The talk is what I work most of my time on, or at least that's the part that I love about the talk. It's like a sermon, but it's a little bit more, it's in between a history lecture, a philosophy lecture, and a sermon in some ways. It's exploratory in a lot of ways because we don't have dogma. And it's evolving in a way. Now I say that, but I can also say that the values that ethical culture represent have stayed pretty consistent over time. I believe the reason they've stayed consistent is that they make some sense to most of the people, because I don't hold a position of authority, which is why the term leader is really odd. But Adler wanted to say, this is like a religion but different. And this was a time where he didn't want to use minister, he didn't want to use priest. When I talk to groups that are interfaith, I usually say I'm humanist clergy, because they get that. When I speak to people who are secular, I say I lead an organization that operates like a religious institution. This morning we have programs every Sunday at 11, and the values that keep coming back in ethical culture, and that the leader, that Felix Adler, who was the person who founded it, first put forward is I narrow it down to 3, although we don't have 10 commandments. There's a list called the 8 commitments of ethical culture. I actually don't use that because to me it's too close to the 10 commandments. It feels a little too didactic, too authoritarian. But the 3 values I think that we agree on is the inherent worth of every individual, which is pretty typical of a lot of liberal religious groups, that every individual is of inherent worth, which is infinite, irreplaceable, if you wish, in some ways. I'm going to come back to that. Second value is the importance of social justice, which in a lot of ways, the way I see it, is simply the universal recognition of the worth of others. And if you really do believe that every individual in the world has inherent worth, I think you have to look at systems which deny that, systems which abuse and oppress people. And so I think social justice has got to be a part of the commitment to inherent worth. And Adler focused on that. And the third value is that the way we try to honor worth and build justice is through relationships. Adler brought together the one area of philosophy that I'll run into a little bit, a very interesting combination of respect for the individual, which really comes out of the Enlightenment project, has a lot of, in some ways Adler looked at Christianity as a great role model for putting the individual at the center of concern. On the other hand, he came out of Reform Judaism, which was a very collectivist view, and he had respect for collectivist theories of identity. So I tend to think sort of Hegelian theories, where you are what you are by virtue in your role in a greater whole. The whole comes first, and the individual comes out of that. So that would be a Hegelian perspective in a way. And Adler looked at the United States and saw this over-deification of the individual, this putting the individual as the ultimate value, and said, at the expense of all else, the individual is elevated. So you have ruthless social Darwinism. You have individuals using liberty to crush other people. You have to take into account that we are what we are by the fact that we are also not just an individual, but we're also a member of a family, member of an institution, a college. And those relationships are not external to your identity. They are part of who you are. And that really spoke to me. I mean, I really do. I was talking on the way out with Alex and Joe. I consider myself an existentialist in some ways, who believes that my individuality is very, very important to me. My ability to claim for myself my own choices and not be defined by externals. On the other hand, I also believe that a part of me is created through organic relationships with others. So that my relationship to my parents, my relationships to my children make me who I am. And this was crystallized in my graduate work when I got my graduate degree in philosophy, when I was studying simple ways that we looked at ethical behavior. I took the case of a father who comes back to his home and he races into a building to save his child. And he runs out with the child. And in a lot of Western paradigms, people would say, well, he was being altruistic. Look, he sacrificed himself for his child. Or, equally, they could say, Well, he was just doing it out of self-interest. He couldn't have lived with himself had he let his child die. But both of those analyses assume that ethics is nothing more than a balancing of individual needs or rights. That's all ethics is. In my mind, I imagined running into the building, this was before I had kids when I was in graduate school, that he ran into the building because he was his father. Because he was the father of the child. Which is a very different way of understanding why you do things. To a degree, it assumes an obligation or it assumes a connection that exists even prior to choice. So that balance is one reason why, when I found ethical culture, 10 years after I did this graduate work, it appealed to me. So we have an organization that meets weekly. We celebrate the cycles of life, so we have next week, 2 weeks from today, we have our winter solstice, which is a celebration of coming together to get through the dark times. We light candles and call back the light, like many pagan and Christian and Jewish and so on. So almost every religion has some sort of a coming together at times of darkness when the season brings the darkness in to move us towards light. We have a spring festival, we have various traditions like Memorial Day where people remember people who have died recently. Many of the same things that religious communities do, we do. And one of the reasons is, given the fact that religion is very maligned. I actually am sort of throwing away my script. I was going to go into how maligned religion was because of, well, I think free thought, you guys probably have plenty of arguments why that's the case. It can spring out of a sense of weakness, people think, right, that you need religion, it's a crutch. But I'm going to put that aside for now because I want to stop in about 2 minutes and see if there are questions before I go on to the second part, which is what I think of as human spirituality. But I think many of the members who come to the Ethical Society are not feeling the sense of connection that may have been fulfilled at one time through an organic relationship to a town. In small villages, people knew each other. There's some sociologists that say that you can know up to about 150 people. I don't know if you know that number, which is an actually interesting number for congregational development. That when you turn from a religious community over 150, you have to organize differently because people don't know themselves personally. But that once people found themselves in larger and larger settings, their sense of community ironically went down and down and down. So this greater sense of alienation and larger groups begin to creep. So ethical culture offers to many of the people that come to the Ethical Society this sense of community. But it also offers a chance to try to live closer to their ethical ideals. So the thing that I talked about today was conscience. It was an exploration of what is conscience. For me, I believe I kind of know what's right or wrong in my life. And you guys tried to pin me down to give a formula for it, and I sidestepped and evaded every chance that I could. But I feel like I have a pretty good sense of moral compass. I feel what I don't do well is I don't apply that well in my daily life. I don't apply it well in my daily life. I cheat on it. And by being in groups, we actually come together and say, how can we do this better? And we support each other, we can remind each other, we can call each other out a little bit, and practically, we leverage our community better. So for example, we're part of an interfaith coalition in Philadelphia called POWER, which is actually, it's primarily out of the Black Urban Church, very powerful civil rights tradition, civil rights organizing, but they have leveraged it to the point where they are having an effect on city council policy in Philadelphia. So in addition to coming together and forming this community, it allows us to feel that we're actually making a difference. So if in fact the legislation goes forward, city employees and contractors will be getting $15 an hour minimum wage stepped in over the next 3 or 4 years. And we can debate whether that's good or bad. We think it's good, but it helps a sense of isolation and incapacity get overcome. And finally, we offer humanist inspiration. And that's where I'll go to a little bit more in the second half, where I talk about what I mean by humanist spirituality and whether that term makes sense or not. But I want to stop for, 10 or 15 minutes and see, after I sort of pontificated for 15 minutes, whether you have questions or whether it's clear or you have clarification questions or... You two again. All right.
Joe, you want to go first?
The guy who showed up first.
All right.
Joe.
Well, you talked about the three values of ethical humanism that you hold, but I'm wondering how the first two values are different from one another. Because it sounded like the social justice value was very similar to the value of valuing all human beings. How
Well,
are those differentiated?
I think there's an interiority of the sense of inherent worth. I mean, Adler probably quoted Kant more than anybody, and just the idea that you can, A, have ethics and religion as separate was the first thing ethical culture said. But the second, and probably even more important factor, is that the individual has worth in and of themselves, independent of anything else, anybody else. Nobody gives you your worth. It is part of who you are. It's wrapped up in your very essence. Well, let me give you an example. Adler talks about the difference between worth and value. And he uses these two words this way. He says, worth is inherent in you. Value is determined by somebody outside. So I'm hired by the Ethical Society to do certain things, and they pay me money. That's my value. My value is determined by people outside of me. And it can be capricious, it can be taken away, whereas worth is wrapped up in who I am. So it's like an inalienable right, in a way. And when not Jefferson, but when King used the word inalienable, he meant it is part and parcel with who you are. As I said, I'm not promoting the belief in that, but I'm promoting a commitment to that. So people who come to the Ethical Society and say, I want to try to live a way where I am treating people as if they have infinite worth. They can't be replaced. You can't use a utilitarian calculus to say I'm going to, experiment on these 10 people in order to cure 1 million people. That violates some basic agreement that we have when we get together. On the other hand, if you take everybody's worth into view, you're probably going to have some utilitarian calculus in there. So there's a tension there. They don't go together easily. And so when I come here to give a talk, because I am a humanist clergy of the Ethical Society, I'm coming as representing this whole. I'm denying my wife my attention on a Sunday, and I'm not doing it for. It's not an expression of my existential autonomy necessarily. It's a choice I'm making to be in this collective. So in some ways, I think they rub against it. There's a friction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
You want to add? Yeah, sure. Yeah, whatever. Right, yeah.
I was going to say, I think there's a difference. Well, and that's sort of one of the focuses of like ethical culture, ethical humanism, is action being a part of that, the choice to be within that community. So I think the inherent worth is the philosophy, the thought. This commitment to social justice is the commitment to acting on that thought in the world. And so if you understand that, if I feel that way, and I understand I'm in relationship with Hugh who feels that way, that every human being has inherent worth, but we look into the world and we realize that that is not the reality of what's happening, and that part of our being part of ethical culture is trying to change that. So that's what I would add to that.
And I didn't give enough of the history, but when Adler started the New York Society, he also founded the Ethical Culture School, which was at that time called the Working Men's School. It was trying to get members of all different trades and backgrounds into a school system, sort of an experiment in democracy, a little along the lines that Dewey would talk about later, John Dewey. But he also was involved in creating the first free kindergarten, settlement houses. He worked with the Child Study Association. He worked with the Tenement House Commission of New York, trying to condemn tenements that were being used to reap profits off of the poor. Ethical culture was involved in the founding of the NAACP, the ACLU, it was a active commitment to social justice. So that's where I think it doesn't necessarily connect as much with that inward respect for the worth of the individual. And it rejects explicitly altruism because Kant believed, for example, that suicide was immoral because you have your own worth. So it rejects the concept of self-sacrifice that's somehow put on a pedestal in some of the more flagellating Christian sects.
Yeah, actually, Karan had a question. You should go with him first. Oh, before he asks his question, though, we appreciate your choosing to be part of this communal space and such at the expense of others.
Thank you. It is rewarding because I enjoy being part of the community. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering what the relationship would be between individual worth and this totality of this inalienable individual worth and individual freedoms, and if you're viewing freedoms also in that inalienable way, how that would maybe conflict with the second tenet, which is social justice. Say, if you need to be curtailing some freedoms in order to get further with social justice, how the trade-offs would work there.
It's less about how you solve that tension and how do you manage it, because it's always going to be there in one way or another. I mean, I don't think you're ever going to be able to. Ethical culture rejects neat metaphysical things that somehow collapse the individual into the whole, or somehow, defends the individual over the whole in some way or another. There are going to be times where in most people's lives, you need to practice self-care. You need to retreat from the world. You need to feed yourself. And there are going to be times where you're going to be called to be out in the world, working for the relationships in the community. And there isn't a real explanation of that. I mean, I think those are the toughest moments when you're trying to work out that those are both necessary. But because you were asking, how do you balance?
How do you balance trade-offs? How do you? I mean, is there any mechanism by which you decide, even if there's no absolutes either way? Is there any mechanism by which you try to mediate? I mean,
I don't think I don't have any absolutes myself, and I don't think Adler would promote any absolutes in that way. You have to be sensitive and open in a way. I think you have to observe and not prejudge.
But I think to the extent that there's existence of poverty, when he created ethical culture, it was in response to the things that were going on at the time. Contextually, there was a depression or sort of a stock market.
Oh, there was a lot of crashes in the late 1800s, yeah.
Yeah, and so it was like this, in this Gilded Age, right, where he comes up with these needs that the government isn't meeting. So I would feel like, and this, I guess, more personal, is that tension, it would be to the extent that poverty exists. So how can we be fully free and not, and also in the sense of harming others, if while we have what we have, someone that means other people have to suffer. So that's for me where I would say that if there was a line that drawn how to balance that tension is to the extent that poverty has to exist. And I think he was of the belief that poverty didn't have to exist for what we had the ability to do, and that our communities of faith should be in the direction of alleviating the social ills.
Communities of faith and secular and government.
Yeah, and government. Yeah.
I mean, the difference of the U.S. government from 1860, when Adler began to even think about this, and 1920 is huge. You have the birth of social work. Charity was only in places of worship in the middle of the 1800s. By 1920, you have the growth of government services, the science of sociology, which didn't exist, where you began to study that people's fates are not determined just because they are morally corrupt, which is what most people believed in 1850 if you were poor. You began to see what are the systemic, in particular urban causes of poverty, and that there's a science to that, and that in order to counter that, you have to provide education, inoculations, food, school programs. Ethical culture did a lot of work with youth by providing job opportunities, training for jobs, things like that. Did you?
I had a question, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have two questions now. So the first is about how the philosophy of Marx connects to what you said in your talk in two ways. So the first is that you emphasize the alienation. And when one says alienation, one immediately thinks of Marx.
Or sorry.
So, or sorry, yeah, certainly. Who was a Marxist, incidentally. So,
Sort of.
yeah.
Very comfortable Marxist.
Yeah. So, in what sense does the philosophy of Marx with regards to alienation connect to this? And then second, the mission of ethical culture that you said is not to lose the practice in the metaphysical, baggage, metaphysical,
Right.
complicated maze. That sounds to me a lot like Marx's praxis, that it's not enough to have a metaphysical understructure that you're satisfied with, but that you need to put pragmatics into place within a philosophy.
Yeah. Adler didn't use the term praxis, but I think he pretty much believed in it, that knowledge is only what it is by its through application, and that knowledge is a constantly changing creation of theory, and then application, and then readjusting the theory, and reapplication, and so forth. So I do think there's some of that in his. But the first part, I mean, certainly, in alienation is the fact that the ownership of the means of production means that a worker can put his labor into an object and then have that part of his personhood taken away without his consent. In some ways that's very similar because there is a relational identity in Marx. You are what you are by virtue of your relationship to the greater whole. So a worker is what they are by virtue of the fact that they produce the goods of society, and the bourgeoisie are what they are by the fact that they own the means of production. They don't produce the goods of society. So that's very similar, but what worried Adler about Marxism and socialism was it was totally materialistic, because that's what Adler believed in this. I mean, he was a little bit of an idealist in the traditional sense. There's a piece of him that sounds an awful lot like some Platonism is still there, where he believes in some sort of abstract, perfect world, but I leave that stuff behind, frankly. I mean, because it doesn't seem to make sense to me. But what he does believe is that there has to be more than just the material world defining who we are. And that's where he turns to psychological relationships. So the alienation that I was using in ethical culture is when people don't feel like they're in circles of friendship. They don't have expectations of one another. There's not a sense of consistency. That's, if I fall ill tomorrow, somebody will be there for me. That's what I meant by alienation. It's sort of I urge you to go on a website called idealist.com. It's by Ami Dar, and he spoke at one of our conferences. Basically, Ami reflected some things in a real sensible way for me, and he said he thought that the biggest problem was that he used the metaphor of a skyscraper. There was a horrible murder that was used in all sorts of sociology textbooks of Kitty Genovese. She was murdered in the New York area, I think in early 60s, 63 or something. And supposedly, like 4 dozen people heard her screaming for help, and nobody called the police. And this was written about over and over and over again. And the theory behind it, and I don't think it's an airtight theory, but it's pretty convincing in a storytelling sort of way, is that the more people there are, the more people tend to think that somebody else will solve the problem. So there were experiments that are kind of interesting, that if somebody falls down, fakes a bike injury, if they're on a crowded street, the chances of them being helped are less than if they're on a street with one person, because the person who sees them immediately takes responsibility. So Ami talks about the fact that we're all in our apartments and we're all looking out at the horrors of what's happening. People, the people are starving. And he started this tradition saying at 3 o'clock on this day, everybody walk outside of your house and look up and down the street and see who's there and go and say hello to them, which I thought was a romantic and a neat idea. But he was basically saying we don't have connection with one another. So the alienation is more psychological. That we were talking, well, I'm not going to go down there, but we were talking about online dating, which is very alienating in the ironic manner that you have access to more people than anyone, but it can be incredibly alienating and objectifying because the work of relationship is somehow inorganic in a way. And it may just be the fuddy-duddy in me that I don't understand it. So,
Can I ask one
yeah,
thing?
yeah.
You were asked about the first two principles. I'm interested in the third because you put Hegel into the picture,
Right.
and I'm very worried
Okay.
because I come from a very Hegelian society,
Right.
which is the Italian one.
Mhm.
And I wonder if when you say that roles are important, what are these roles? I'm thinking it's a bit like with Rachel, we're doing a class on theory and practice. We're reading exactly Radical Feminism from the 70s in Italy by Carla Lonzi, whose title is Let's Speed on Hegel.
Right.
And her problem with Hegel is like, if you actually, Hegel looks
Who sets
amazing.
the roles?
Exactly. No? And then, okay, cool, this is amazing. We're part of a family. And then I end up with the wrong end of the. So I wonder.
Right, right. Well, unfortunately, he's airing our dirty laundry. Adler, the founder, had a very Victorian mindset. The worst things about him is he had these assumptions of essentiality, and they were gendered. So that is very problematic. So again, not to try to be evasive, but to try to be true to what I mean, I don't think they are defined roles. What I mean by that more so is that when I truly try to look at myself in my life, I really do believe that I am a father, and that implies things that are independent of my existential choices. I have fallen into them. If Alasdair MacIntyre wrote an essay that was very used called After Virtue, and no, that wasn't, it's a chapter in After Virtue, it's a book. But he talks about a little bit similar to what Appiah talks about when he talks about cosmopolitanism, saying that when you're, for example, when you're born into a family, you don't choose to have obligations to your parents, but you're born in them. There is a social fabric that you're born into, and you inherit the roles. You have a lot of freedom to decide what those roles mean, but nevertheless, you're born into them. And there's a piece of me that feels that I've been plopped into this world, and I don't get to choose all of my relationships because they are internal to me. Even before my sense of identity was formed, I began to have relationships that were organic. And so that, and with my children, when I held my children first in my arms, it wasn't so much of an extension. It involves emotion. So it's much more of a sense that we're not just an autonomous individual. And I think we do injustice to both the psychological reality of being a human being, and I think we see destruction in our legal system. The Western legal system is totally based on the autonomy of individuals. And I think we do great damage when you look at child welfare during divorces. I mean, it's horrible. Rather than looking at what would be healthiest for the unit, even if the unit was separated, in households. You're still a family. The child still has a mother and how that works. I think we need to do a better job of looking at those obligations as elements that are inherent to us.
And you cannot think of this kind of roles in relationship outside of a nuclear family.
Oh, no, you can't. Absolutely. No, I don't want to privilege any form of role. I don't think there's any essentialist role that you have to be this or that in gender. No. But I think it's just more related. So let's not use roles, because I should probably not use it. Let's say relationships. Cool. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then let me just say a couple of things about spirituality, because I think we're running out of time, but I don't have a lot to say.
We're doing fine. We've got 25 minutes, so maybe we can take these two questions and then we have kind of quick, and then we'll move on.
Okay, good.
So you talk about a sense of obligation in these relationships, a sense of I need to do this outside of my existential world.
Right.
That sounds exactly like religion and the Ten Commandments. In fact, I would say it is the same sense of objectivity. But I would contend that you would say that's not the case. You'd say that they're different, fundamentally different. If so, how? If not, why aren't you religious?
Well, I am, in that I'm in a culture, so it's religious but not theistic. I mean, there's plenty of non-theistic religions. I mean, some Zen Buddhism wouldn't consider it. There's plenty of Buddhist religions that are theistic. Unitarian Universalism is quite often, not everybody, there are some that are theists. So
Well,
for me, I would say, instead of religious, say maybe congregational and inspirational. I mean, for me, what makes ethical culture a religion is that we meet regularly to create relationships that are deeper. That congregational format is what Dewey, in A Common Faith, talks about, the historical and institutional element, right? Another terrible book to read, but great ideas, is A Common Faith by John Dewey. He's a terrible writer. But he said basically religion is institutional and religious is experiential. And he said the religions have to learn to get out of the way so people can have religious experiences. Religions are getting in the way of the religious experience. So we try to offer an institutional, a community, an ongoing place where people can be and feel connected, and we try to offer inspiration to people. And that's where the spirituality comes in for me. So, I mean, rather than reading. So, but let me get back to your, because you had a pointed, and I don't want to ignore that. What makes it different than, okay, I guess I'm not telling you what your obligation is. That's why I don't like the 8 commitments, because it feels too much like, here they are. I'm thinking that part of living life runs into a sense of obligation at times. I'm not quite sure where that comes from. But for me, it's not because I chose it. It feels like it comes to me. For example, a mathematical truth. I mean, that's what when Plato talks about the forms, right? He talks about the fact that there are some things that strike you with power, and they're not your choice, okay? So when you prove something in math and you see a truth or whatever, wow, it's not your choice, right? So it feels like it's coming to you from the outside. I'm saying the same sort of thing happens in ethical situations in life.
But doesn't it happen with the Ten Commandments? My question is, that seems to me like a true religious experience, and people who understand the Ten Commandments, as some of my friends do, they say the exact same thing.
So if you stumbled onto a situation where somebody was in great pain and you felt this force of needing to help them, you describe that as a religious experience in a way, right? Is that what you mean?
I'm saying that the authoritarian nature of what you're describing isn't distinct from the 2 cases. It is just as authoritarian.
Because
I need to do this.
Okay, then I would say the authoritarianism of religion is institutional, and it's imposed on me by other people. Whereas the authority and obligation that I'm talking about seems to come just from living, not from a person.
Okay.
Is that? And if you want to call that religious, that's fine. But it happens to me. The same way that I go 2 + 2 = 4. Oh, or a circle is a set of points equidistant from a local. Oh, it's not my choice. And there are times where I feel like I don't have a choice, and I feel like we become evasive if we. You can choose to pick it up or not. So I'm still an existentialist in that regard. I'm not saying I don't want to practice bad faith, saying, well, I had to do it. But I do feel like I can say, I am going to open myself to what feels like something that I need to do. Okay. I mean, maybe not everybody has that experience. That's fair. I don't deny that. But that to me is what spirituality is about to a degree, is feeling this connection to a greater whole, right? I mean, that's when people, that's one of the elements that people say, well, what makes a religion? And a lot of people say it's a connection to a greater whole. And what ethical culture is not saying is that the greater whole is somehow this dualistic universe where you have, the earthen, soiled, failed, flawed material world and a perfect world. And it's by becoming one with a perfect world that we can have this connection to the whole. That is explicitly what Adler said is absurd, because you're making up for, there's no, he believed in evidence. He believed in things that you could verify. Public policy should come from evidence. So, but there are times where I want to feel that oceanic feeling. That's just a term people use to describe what a lot of people feel like in religious experiences. I think you can get it from anything. You can get it from athletics, you probably can get it from drugs, you can get it from sex, you can get it from music. I think that is a form of spirituality that doesn't make any assumptions of an otherworldly existence. It's more of a product of psychology. So, we don't always do it very well, but at the Ethical Society, we try to create programs where people can tap into that sense of awe and mystery. And if you read Carl Sagan, I mean, this is not a man who was, likely to, fall prey to religion. It's interesting. Einstein talked about, he was asked, do you believe in God? He was not consistent. You can read, sometimes he sounds like he's a theist, and other times he sounds like an atheist. But one of his comments that I thought was interesting was he said, I believe in Spinoza's God. And, the crackerjack explanation of Spinoza is God is nature. It's one and the same thing. And if that's what people want to believe is God, and they're not going to violate the laws of observation, and they're not going to violate the scientific method, I don't have a problem with people calling that God. What I have a problem is people basing public policy over things that can't be verified through intersubjective agreement. So I think there's a role for paying attention to the desire to have these experiences that people might call are spiritual and inspirational and awe-inspiring. And for me, my father was a physicist, and I didn't like, my younger brother liked it, but he would go out to the lawn and get the telescopes, and they had a star log, and they'd write all their numbers down. But I would just lie next to them and look, and that to me was, as a 12-year-old, as spiritual as I could get. But it was important. It was just a holy... And, and we're limited in space, we're limited in time. Those moments when a chill comes down your spine and you realize that you're finite. That seems to me a religious experience. And it can lead to many different feelings. We try to create a community where those feelings can be celebrated in a way that enhances your life, that gives you a sense of energy, that makes you feel like you can get up the next day and do the work that you feel like you need to do. Is that a legitimate use of the term spirituality, or is it, because I don't really want to defend the term, but a lot of people say, well, I'm religious, I'm spiritual but not religious. And I don't want to get into a fight about, because in some ways I think I'm religious but not spiritual. I mean in terms of, if people think spirituality means believing in another world, for example, or souls, which I don't. So one of the things I think is an issue for secularists is not to mock the religious impulse in believers. If they feel somehow their religion gives them this sense of being connected to a greater whole, if it helps them make sense of their lives, that doesn't bother me if it's helping them act ethically. It bothers me if it helps them act like authoritarians. Which is, it can go either way. That's what I'm saying. And institutionally, it's proven quite often to go the wrong way. But there are plenty of people that get out of ethics. I mean, I would rather live in a world full of people who believe in God doing good than a world full of people who don't believe in God hurting each other. And that just seems common sense to me. And so that's one of the reasons why I liked Ethical Culture's compromise, which is trying to not sacrifice reason, not sacrifice the scientific method, but at least pay attention to these other needs that are not irrational. They may be non-rational. They may have nothing to do with reason, but they're part of our makeup, they're part of our needs. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned afterwords and McIntyre, because I was just reading that book in a class, and the example that struck me when he was talking about essentially his view that you can have this morality within these communities because of the social context and the roles. What struck me is what I went back to is the Indian caste system, where you have very defined roles which people absolutely do buy into, but an external observer might look at it and say this is horrific. And let's even take somebody who says like one of the top caste members they have this sense of identity which they think is deeply tied into this role that they believe in, and it's exclusionary. So I was wondering what you think of social roles like that, which seem to be, I mean, at least on McIntyre's view, completely legitimate.
Yeah. The same answer I gave here, where I think I don't subscribe to a particular set of roles. I mean, if anthropology has taught us nothing, it's that you can choose, thousands of different constructions of what your roles are. So what I'm saying, though, is that roles do, again, I shouldn't use the word probably, but they help create your identity. They are part of you, I feel like. So, yeah, I would challenge the Indian caste system because it violates the worth of individuals. I mean, that's where I would go back to. If everybody has inherent, irreplaceable worth, how can you call someone untouchable? Yeah.
Would be the last question.
I guess my response to that response is kind of in the sense of where's that line of because there's a bit of relativity, like a comfortability with relativity in ethical culture, in the sense of that understanding we might have a different relationship to how we set up ethics and what is ethical, and part of that, the work of an ethicist is figuring that out. Not to say exactly what's right and wrong, but how do we gain an understanding through relationship of how we relate to that question of what's right and wrong differently, and sort of what else can come from that. So in the sense of like, how do you balance critiquing a culture without demeaning that culture? Because I think you have to offer a bit of that relativity to the differences in the establishment of those systems, but also understanding like the sort of outer limits of what it might mean to speak for someone to speak on another culture's workings that's from an outside. It's like it may not be my place to critique the caste system in India, but I could support the inherent work by supporting people who, from within that culture, who might be oppressed and speaking up. And so that might be a better way to support them rather than me saying it from an outside or from a privileged position.
There are fewer and fewer closed systems. And so I think there are opportunities to be a gadfly in those cultures in a way that you've got to be awfully careful.
Yeah.
Is that? I feel like I've thrown a lot on the table. I hope it's worth something. I mean, not necessarily good, but you can get me in emails. I'd love to hear any other questions or stuff you have. And the reason, by the way, I wear this is that I don't have any garb. We don't have any silly hats in ethical culture. I've been asking for a silly hat. Right. So I wear a suit every time I do my Sunday program. But just to show you that roles are not essential. It's not going to do this. So. Yeah.
No, talk about spirituality. I mean.
All right.
Yes.
So, all right. So I said I talked a little bit about the science behind it. I mean, there is something. Freud talked about the desire to feel at one with all reality to be a limitless narcissism. That somehow this desire to be at one with all is self-serving. Maybe it is. But when you feel connected, whether it's with, at a sporting event and the crowd is cheering together, or when there's harmony in your family at a holiday meal or something, when there's that sense of connection, it can provide that sense of oceanic connection. Now, what dangerous to me is that that's also the same feeling that the Nazis were trying to create in their troops.
Perfection.
That sense of where somehow being at one with the whole relieves you of all responsibility. And so that is, I think, one of the dangers of that oceanic feeling. is that it can lead you to not take responsibility. So that's why I always like to mix the two and say, for at least in my life, that I both have to take responsibility for my choices, and one of my choices is to feel that individualism is gone. So in some ways I bracket it, I give myself safe containers for it. I don't let it rule all my life, and I try to balance it off. So I try, for me, I think a lot of when I was young, I honestly, probably my most regular religious experience was coming home to watch the original Star Trek, which was on, I think at 8 o'clock on Friday nights. This was in 1969 or 8 or something. But it was developed in a way, I think, that was particularly attractive to people who had lost faith in God. I mean, it was this journey into other worlds where there was boundless possibility, and you were along with them. So that element of spirituality is important to me. I'll just, let me read, turn to Sagan, who again is one of my favorites for this. He said, "When we recognize our place in the immensity of light years and in the passages of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined, is surely spiritual." And I love the fact that he says that sense of elation and humility combined. Because I think that there is a humbling, the fact that, probably shouldn't use the fact, my belief that I'm a speck on this planet hurtling through space at 10,000 miles an hour, which is the speed relative to the center of our galaxy, I believe, and the galaxies are flying all over the place, is absolutely mind-blowing, legitimately, and not something that I should simply, it's a mundane fact of existence. And I have to remind myself of that quite often. That, I think, is a sense of awe that is worth nurturing. Same thing with that's our limitation in space, right? Same thing with our limitation in time. I think one of the things that humanists and freethinkers would be most thanked for is to do a better job of talking about our mortality in ways that allow us to deal honestly with it. The fact that we are limited in time, and we're here for a second, how do you process that in a way that makes sense? In both of these limits, I turn to imagination, and there was a term that Sagan uses a term, the spirituality of the actual. The spirituality of the actual. And what he meant by that is looking at the universe as it is. That there's spiritual experiences there. John Dewey talked about a term, he said, spirituality of the possible. And what he meant by that was imagination. The ability for us to think of the world as it could be and not as the way it is to me the fundamental element in ethical culture that helps us not simply accept the way the world is. I think the world could be better. I can imagine it being better. There are many different ways. I don't know how it would be better, but I certainly think that if 10,000 kids a day die of starvation or hunger-related diseases, that was a statistic, I think, 10 years ago. We've gotten better. Maybe it's 8,000, but that's stunning. In a place where there's enough food to feed everybody, 8,000 kids a day dying of hunger-related diseases, and yet it is amazing that any of us is alive. Looking honestly at our mortality, I think, would help us develop a sense of spirituality that is lived in a way. So people say, well, what does that mean? I say, well, I use my imagination. I try to imagine what the world's going to be like after I'm gone. It doesn't get rid of that weird, spooky feeling that you get when you really contemplate it. But when I think about my children in the future, I imagine them, carrying on what they might be like. I think about the ethical society after I'm gone, etc. And I think that maybe one or two of the things that I did actually made it easier for them to continue on. That to me is important to think about. So one of the things I did when I taught school was I had my kids write their own epitaph, which I got some nasty letters from parents about. And I probably should have thought, this was early in my teaching career. That's a pretty heavy thing to do. But I encourage people to do that. What would you like said at your funeral? I say, I'm not going to do that, it's morbid. But it can be incredibly liberating, especially if you do it in a community of people where you pass it around, you compare and you laugh. Right? There are a lot of cultures that handle mortality a lot better than we do. They look at it as part of part of life. My wife's father was born in Nicaragua, lived in Mexico, and so we go down there, and Day of the Dead is an example of this. You know, I know Day of the Dead is so commercialized in this country, but I love it. I don't mind it so much. You get little skulls on everything. Nobody's nodding, but don't you see it everywhere? Day of the Dead stuff? Maybe you don't. Or maybe you don't know, you know, little, okay, well, there you go.
Yeah,
there
what the hell is water, right?
What's that?
Like the fish who's like, what the hell is water?
Yeah, where it's a bony thing instead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Day of the Dead, they celebrate on Halloween, and they go to grave sites, and they put candy and food and candles on the grave sites of their elders, and the kids run around. In Guatemala, they put notes on kites, and they soar the kites up to give the messages to their relatives. But there is an incorporation of mortality in those cultures, which I think helps us deal with the reality that we're in. Whereas in the United States, mortality is just shoved to the side. Nursing homes, hospitals. It's the last place people want to be.
Or the delay, the attempts to delay it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm 61, and I forget it. I know that's part of my resistance. But one of the greatest gifts that my children got was my wife's father, who had a terrible stroke that lived for 10 years, and he lived in a nursing home. My kids got there, and they learned to live with things that many of us don't learn to live with, which is aging and death. But I think that sense of connection that can be gone through that, it takes support, it takes each other, it takes reading about it, it takes writing about it, it takes expressing it. And as a quote-unquote clergy person, I do memorial services. It's one of the places I feel the most value added. I feel like when I come to a family that's in grief, and I give them an opportunity to celebrate the life of a loved one, it's an incredible gift for them. And it's not that hard. I've learned it's not that hard. You have a series of readings, you say, well, how do you want to remember them? How do you want to do this? It's okay to feel how you're feeling. There's no one way to do it. Everybody goes through this. You know, you help them through a process that's natural. But I think that to me is a form of spirituality. You have to wrap it around that mentality. And the last piece, because what time is it?
4:19. So you have about 5 minutes.
All right. Spirituality of action. Ethical culture, I haven't talked enough about it. One of our bumper stickers is deed before creed. It's more important what you do than you say. So I would say that those other two forms of spirituality don't mean anything if they don't help you act in life in ways where you feel you are making a bigger difference, where you're living in ways that are closer to your values. And I'll just end it on that. There. I think we want to break because people, I'm sorry if I took up a little too much air in the room, but feel free to take a card, email me. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your pushback and your further questions. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for speaking, Hugh.
And I really have to apologize to you because you had to sit through my chat.
No,
I could hear yours.
I came exactly for that purpose. No worries at all.
But yeah, I have to get back to DC tonight, and I still have 2 other meetings. Thank you.
Oh, Hugh, before you leave,
Yeah.
we have a nice little gift for you.
Yay. Swag? Do I get free thought swag?
No, the gift is love and appreciation.
Hey, I'll take it.
It's actually Haverford swag.
Matthew, is it the gray one or the black one?
It's the black one.
The black one? All right. We got you a Haverford sweatshirt, and we got you a nice little hat. I don't know how cold it gets in DC.
It gets cold. It gets cold. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, can we get a picture with the organizers?
Yeah.
Sure. Do it. Thank you.
I gotta use your cell phone.
Yeah.
My camera died.
Yeah, can you use
It might actually.
Yeah, I don't think
I think I might be able to listen one
I'll
more.
hold it up.
Yeah, everyone, feel free to mingle, get some refreshments. We're going to come back at 4:35.
We're having a picture here.
Right. I'm just
Yeah.
waiting for him. I'm just seeing if... Hugh, do you want us to get Ali as well? Just the 4 of us?
Yeah,
Either way.
tell him to come back.
All right, yeah.
Well, it doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do.
Let's do
I
one
just
with the
want
4 of
you
us,
to-
and then we'll get Ali.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Let's see.
How can I get in the middle? I can't get in the middle, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not that athletic anymore.
Let's get that background. What do you think? Better than white, stark white? Don't get too photography on us.
Listen, I'm not gonna do it. Y'all just go wherever y'all want.
Does this look too dorky?
That is a professional problem.
We're all just right, Dorky.
Newsletter.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Alec, please. Let's get in a picture.
Thank you.
Tutte foto tutti insieme. Sorry, I'm speaking Italian. Tutte photos all together. Yes.
Yes.
There we go.
It's a pretty narrow focal length. Sorry, y'all.
You're doing good.
You haven't seen the pictures yet.
Interesting. I've seen your work.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, Hugh.
I appreciate it.
All right, and then we have a brief break again for refreshments. Yeah, and then we'll get started back up shortly.
4:35.
If there's any folks interested in dance and poetry, on the 23rd, I'm going to be leading a platform at the Ethical Society at 11 o'clock, and it'll be examining shadows. So,
Literal and figurative?
figurative, because I don't know if I could do the lighting well enough. But it'll be. You ever heard of Boutel? You heard? Are you? Yeah. So. Have you heard of that before? Boutel? Yeah. You should check it out. I think it's gonna be cool. I'm gonna be. Yeah. You have time.
No worries.
Good talking. Yeah. Good rest. You to break.
This attitude towards death and having it very present.
Listen, hope it goes better. And
Yes.
Hold on, Joe. That's Will.
And then if
Yeah,
they know how to talk. So they're here, actually, you're having a good
No, it's true. I
Yeah,
every
so
time
I'm
in my
like clergy for my
I
work. Yeah, I work in a city.
Going around these.
You
Is it on a Google?
It's even in the news.
Knock it out.
Corridos, they're just endless.
Nice to meet you.
Life is worth nothing, you know. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll blame the church for that.
Yeah,
Are you in neuroscience?
No.
So you have the slides. Use the literature, me and I.
Literature. Science and humanities. Excellent. Latin American literature.
Is actually a song.
So the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Of course, where it comes as both.
Yes.
Right? Take care. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah. Are you a dancer? Do you dance?
No, my little sister is some kind of program at a studio. I thought someone came in to.
Was it Victoria?
No, that was there.
Yeah, but you recognize it, so I feel like so.
Yeah,
We don't have
Well, have a good day.
we haven't quite gotten
Yeah, it'll be cool. I'll see you sometime.
Take it easy, Christian. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming. Go to his event, guys. It's going to be great. Take care of you. Thanks for coming.
I'm gonna run to the bathroom.
Oh, Chris, it's to your right. It's in this little curve this way.
All right, thank you.
All right. Good thing Cindy isn't here to read all of our emails.
I thought it was the YouTube suggestions that were funny because at first I thought they were Roberta's. I was like, interesting. Not what I would have picked.
Are YouTube suggestions?
Really?
Oh my god, that just
That just was my account.
Oh, that's just
It was
precious.
my account.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I was outed, Alex.
Oh, that is great. You were outed? Oh
As a
man.
conservative.
Oh,
No.
man.
As a conservative.
It comes in
It's
the
a-
middle of our job.
Jordan-
Peter and I like that.
Jordan fucking Peterson, like super liberal, like, oh, you need to question authority if you want to revitalize society. Yeah, no. Conservative.
No,
Fascist.
Alex.
Jordan
Alex.
Peterson?
It was
Yeah.
Alex. It was.
Yeah.
He's
very stupid.
What?
I'm watching it.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Oh no!
Oh no!
Did I say something inappropriate?
No, it's Alex.
I'm
Alex.
just a big fan of Peter.
We're talking. If
I
we
am.
talk
So
about
came out
black
of
people
class,
knew it, though.
someone
Okay, this is a
said.
free speech.
Yeah, exactly. It's
thing.
a safe space for free speech.
But he didn't read enough, I think.
Of course he
support
doesn't.
his claims.
Oh no, he doesn't read enough. He's not a philosopher. I mean, he's an unworthy avatar for a very interesting philosopher. And he has like the folksy wisdom. I mean, he's from Alberta.
I love that.
He lives in the cold
I love him as a
winter.
character.
Yes.
He's very funny.
Yes.
But he's a very ineffective interlocutor and only has these like sort of wins with other very ineffective interlocutors. So that mediocre dialogue is really not entertaining to me.
Really?
Because they have PhD.
Well, you mean like the Kathy Newman, obviously.
Kathy.
Have you seen the Kathy Newman interview?
Oh,
Which one
the
is
Kathy Newman
It's
interview.
precious.
Here we
It's
go.
just precious.
No, it's the one, the famous one at the BBC, something like that.
Yeah, that's
That's Kathy.
Kathy Newman.
Yes.
Kathy Newman's Channel 4. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously those people are, well, I would argue they're not worthy of talking to him. Because he's got the one with the PhD. But for one thing, for clinical psych, he's excellent, like top of his field. Just in philosophy, he struggles because he's not trained and he thinks he knows more than he does.
You just don't know anything.
For clinical psychology,
Psychology.
Pardon me?
Because I know the clinical side of things, and he doesn't sound very.
You say
Really?
the
Very
lobsters
Okay.
are essentially
Because that is neurophysiology 101. It's 80-year-old research. That is
Oh,
not
that's creepy.
that is not really valued.
Oh, damn.
Because serotonin is really, really old ontologically, ontogenically rather, and it can work either way.
Mm.
But anyway,
Oh man.
but he,
I mean, in a
I gotta
200-level
reevaluate.
class, undergraduate class, we're reading Donna Haraway. It's enough, Donna Haraway, it's enough to know that little science that you need to misprove, can't you say, counterprove.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Like,
Really?
read stuff,
Oh,
get
wow.
a PubMed account, and read articles. You
Oh,
don't know
wow. Oh,
anything.
boy.
I'm very sad. Sorry.
No,
But
no,
I like
no.
the performativity of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's great in that regard. Yeah. Yeah.
No, but like I just
Really, I didn't.
What?
I didn't know that he was.
You've got to know your audience. That's why it's controversial.
Because he's done. Yeah, well, because he's
Yes.
counsel for the UN, teaches at UAT, taught at Harvard.
Well, and then he started posting things on YouTube, Alex.
I'm sure there must be
Yeah.
fields in which he is cool,
Yeah, well, certainly.
but as a public speaker, he's very weak, I think.
Yeah. No, it was just like, no, and the worst thing is one of the videos was like one of those things with like the clickbaity title.
Yeah, all those
It
are
was
more.
Like-
SJW.
Jordan Peterson
Obliterates
destroys
SJW.
SJW
Right.
feminists
Yeah.
in the middle of our Dante class.
Yeah.
Just this video.
Although those are the people who
It
follow
says
him.
Jordan Peterson destroys SJW, and I was like, oh,
I'm not-
this is not what I
What's funny is
anticipated.
he
Dante's
reads-
the most conservative author you can ever read, so
Yeah,
it
no,
actually
it's
makes
not
sense.
Dante that's judging him, it's the rest of our
I
class.
see. Dante would probably be very
Well, it's funny because Peterson
Dante
talks
would be
about
like,
Nietzsche
"Ah."
and reads Nietzsche and talks about ressentiment and how it's bad, and his followers are the shitty ones. Like those people are practicing ressentiment to the highest degree, which is if I can't win the culture war and university won't accept my opinions, then I'll go on YouTube and say people get destroyed. Classic ressentiment.
Well, that's also just part of the internet.
The email.
Well, I don't know.
Oh.
Every once in a while, I
So you
watch.
got your USB here.
I mean-
This USB
It's no fun though. He's right. It's such low quality discussion.
I'm not saying I'm not supporting Jordan Peterson.
Now you're so humble. Before you're like, oh, I love him. He's great. Yada,
Well,
yada, yada.
well, no. I think that I find his interviews very entertaining, personally.
Oh, because the people
On
who interview-
on a very superficial level.
the people who
Matthew,
interview
don't
him are
get
not.
nuance.
The people who interview him are not worthy of interviewing him by any stretch. Of
I find it comical.
No, it
I
is
find it comical, and I find the sort of
So you just watch it to be ironic.
Okay.
not entirely. It's
Not
much more
even the first
nuanced
email.
than that.
I mean, let me take a look. Do you send it?
I don't necessarily.
Nuance.
I don't necessarily watch everything of Jordan Peterson's, either because I entirely agree with it or entirely because I disagree with it.
All right, I guess.
It's always trying to develop a wider swath of ideas.
All right, so you have the clicker for the thing? Okay, great. All right.
Am I?
Let's do this.
You could argue I'm dumbing myself down, but
Oh, building.
Watch
All right, so
Fox.
we're going to use some
Nice.
oh, I know.
I'll give you a wide swap.
Every once in a while I watch something. I get suggested things from like Tucker Carlson and Steven Crowder. Every once in a while.
Crowder is kind of a goofball.
I thought he was
But he's textbook libertarian. You know, you can predict everything almost everything that's kind of. He's a smart guy, but ideologically.
Well,
Profoundly uninteresting.
I wouldn't even go so far as saying he's smart.
Wait, who?
Steven Crowder.
He's a
smart?
very mediocre intellect. No, I
Why
mean,
would you say he's smart?
He's a smart guy in the more than 100 IQ sense. Like, he probably got decent SATs and got more or less A's in school. But as far as, like, a serious intellect is concerned, not even close. He's kind of like Ben Shapiro, though. Ben Shapiro's one level up. Because Ben Shapiro is actually philosophically literate, but the philosophy he says, nothing is new, nothing is interesting, and nothing is nuanced.
Yeah,
He's
there's
a great
bunch, like-
debater, though, isn't he?
Oh,
Yeah.
he's a lawyer by training,
That's,
so yeah.
that's what he's so good at.
Right, he's
That's why
fierce.
people watch him, because he's a great debater.
Yeah, and he's really funny.
Is this just the lead-in, like mood music?
Pardon me?
Is that the mood music to just
Totally.
set the tone?
I don't know. What do you think of Bill Maher? Because Peterson was on Bill
Oh,
Maher.
Bill Maher.
You know Bill
Bill Maher. Oh, Bill Maher is great. I love Bill Maher.
Who is Bill Maher?
Bill
Late
Maher
night
is
comedian.
this
He has a TV
left-wing
show.
He's not a late night comedian. He's an HBO comedian.
HBO comedian. Yeah, so he has his integrity. His testicles are still firmly on his body.
Alex.
Is he the guy who does like something?
Talk about political correctness.
No,
just
he's
went out
the
the door.
guy. Bill Maher. Bill Maher.
There
You
is
know what we
is-
need? We need Hitchens back. We need to form some demonic ritual. Like blood,
For Christopher
blood of
Hitchens.
Christian virgins, yada yada yada, and bring back Christopher Hitchens.
No,
Christopher Hitchens and what's the name? Jordan Peterson are
Yeah.
incomparably different, no?
Yes.
Okay.
Which
No,
is
I think
part
we
of why I want
need-
Hitchens back, because it would just be fascinating to see.
I think we need George Carlin back. That's who we need.
Yeah.
We need George Carlin.
Softball catcher was in his early 60s.
I saw him a couple of times over the years. He just,
Dawkins?
no.
George Carlin.
You know, maybe 40 years ago he was
So we
good. After that, he was just
put
too
more
bitter.
light.
Mm-hmm.
The
more light?
Want to turn the light on or off?
On.
On.
It's very
It's
complicated.
a
I'll
very
turn some more on.
non-performative, non-flashy thing. I think we all go to sleep if I'm. Yes. Sweet. Thank you.
All right, you want to get started?
Sure. So, I'm not an expert on political correctness. Okay. In fact, I'm mostly here to discuss political correctness with you, because I'm very curious about what your perception is about this problem and what is the follow-up to the conversation that I had with Matthew that generated this invitation, for which I'm grateful. What happened is that at a tavola italiana, which is this ritual that we do as a department, which we can talk about in terms of spirituality and non-religion totally. Towards the end of a tavola italiana, Matthew, in Italian, which is remarkable, started arguing, correct me if I'm wrong, against political correctness, against an excess of political correctness. Mostly was expressing concern about the fact that political correctness might be used, might be weaponized, might be turned into a tool for censorship, for limiting freedom, specifically on campuses. And I was very interested in that, and I immediately came into this guy and I started replying in English, for some reason, which is interesting, I don't know. Because political correctness is very dear to me, but mostly because I think that what happens, the situation that Matthew was describing, is a lack, is a moment in which political correctness is used in a non-serious way, is considered in a non-rigorous, non-meaningful, non-important way. It's banalized. And I'm very against banalization, and I teach in a liberal arts college because I think that words matter and mean something. And so we had this discussion, then we had an exchange of emails, and then Matthew invited me to continue this discussion in a group. I'm not an expert about political correctness because I'm not a linguist, I'm not a philosopher of language, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not a political scientist. I am a literary historian, which is not really an advantage, a big advantage perspective point to talk about these topics. No? I think that the fact that makes me an interesting interlocutor on this topic is that I'm not American, and that I came here very recently. I come from I started trying to come to America when I was in graduate school in this place, which is in Pisa, the place where Galileo Galilei taught, at the Scuola Normale Superiore, which is this university, which is a tiny university that was founded by Napoleon Bonaparte, 280 years ago. That building there up is the library, which is also the tower where Conte Ugolino ate his children. That was just a reference that I wanted to throw there. The other building made by Vasari is a Renaissance masterpiece of Italian architecture where we did class and stuff like that. In this place, at the time I graduated in 2015, there was one woman with tenure, which was my advisor, Lina Bozzoni, which was the only person who had in the humanities, to have actual connections with America. The person who convinced me to go and have an experience as a visiting graduate student that made me want to apply for jobs in America. And there was one student of college, literally one. There's not many students at Scuola Normale Superiore. It's less than 1,000. It's actually, I think, 600 students in total. But among them, there was one student of color, a significant disproportion between women and men, many more men than women, and in the faculty, one woman with tenure, and I would say one woman professor. All the other women teaching at Scuola Normale are either adjunct or what we call ricercatori, which is a sort of endless postdoc of the Italian old-style system. I decided to go to America because my advisor told me, if you want to become a serious scholar, if you want to have a career in Italian studies, paradoxically, you should really go to America, where actual scholarly stuff is being done. All the other professors all the other mentors that I had were very shocked by this choice, because I'm an Italianist, I'm a literary historian, I'm a humanist, I know Latin, I work in Greek mythology. There's what? If you go to America, you stop your scholarly work. Maybe you're gonna have a bit more money, maybe you're gonna have a nice life, but your scholarship is dead. Because you don't work on women, and you don't work on the Civil War, and you don't work on race. Italian studies, there's nothing to do about these topics, which are the only ones that matter in American academia. So this is the biased point of view with which I arrived to America, okay? I arrived thinking, okay, this is the place. This is before I start applying, actually. This is when I come here as a visiting graduate student. I come here completely sure that I will not be back. I come here because my advisor is very authoritative and I follow her advice. I come to New York University specifically, thinking, okay, I'm going to the place where instead of reading texts and doing literary studies and determining what a sonnet is, things like that, they care only about women authors that are super minor in the Renaissance, things like that. And they don't understand historical perspective and philology and these kind of things. And then I come and I love what I see. There is like in the department where I go, there's Virginia Cox, which is one of the best Renaissance scholars in the world, and she totally studies women's studies, but she shows me that there are women authors in the Renaissance that are much more interesting than the authors that I'm studying. She shows me that you can do an entire course on Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, which was the text on which I was spending most time in my research, exactly questioning its take on gender, its take on race, its take on the beginning of colonialism, which happens exactly when this text was written, etc., etc. So I get converted, basically. Now to what? I'm not sure. To American academia, let's say. I come back and I say, hey guys, to my colleagues, actually it's super cool. They do very advanced stuff that is totally rigorous, that is totally akin to what we do, but it's 20 years ahead of us. They are much more rigorous than we are. They question the problem, the truth that we give for granted. They are not, they're not buying 19th century assumptions that we work on without critical distance. I think I want a career there, and that's what happens. So you're not gonna do anything serious. This is basically where I come from. My take on political correctness is that I was initially shocked by it. I get trained to teach, and when you get trained to teach in an American university, especially when you are from abroad, they insist very much on what is appropriate and what is not, what kind of language you can use and what kind of language is not appropriate and you shouldn't use. And my initial reaction to that was, this is hypocritical. This is a facade that hides serious things. Or this is very risky. Exactly the same thing that Matthew was telling me. This is very risky because, okay, as long as we're saying like you shouldn't use racial slurs, it's fine. I get it, of course, it's common sense. But where does it stop? No, that's the typical ethical question that one comes up with, which is like, okay, but then if people are offended by coffee, will I have to be stopped? Will I have to ban coffee from my classes? If people are offended by Greek art because the Greek colonials in the 40s killed their grandparents, are we gonna like obscure all the Greek vases everywhere? Because where does it end? No? I realized only later when I actually started reading the theory that I'm teaching this year. This happened during my postdoc at Princeton University. That I was biased. That I was looking at political correctness from a point of view that has nothing to do with the historical reality of what political correctness is, and the philosophical reality of what political correctness is. Ciao, Sophie.
Ciao.
We're talking about political correctness.
Okay.
I studied postmodernity and postmodernism, which are things that I was trained to ignore and consider forms of like fashionable American fakeness. And I realized that not only they are not ideological perspective, but conditions, but things that you cannot evade. But that I grew up in them, and that what I used to call Berlusconismo, the Berlusconi way of looking at the world, which is incredibly similar to what Trump is doing now, was exactly weaponizing language by putting the obscene in the center of the scene, and making things that should not be admissible, and saying that if you don't do that, you are oppressed by someone else. My point here is, one, that political correctness is really a label attached to cultural politics by people that don't want, that are threatened by social change. This is an historical argument that leads to a philosophical argument. If political correctness is part of cultural politics, and it is, and it's criticized for producing a change that is not wanted, so for making people unable to speak or things like that, there is a fallacy, there is a mistake there, because what you're doing by criticizing political correctness is exactly a form of cultural politics. This is all based on Worf. I don't know if you're familiar with the Worfian hypothesis, which is that language determines or influences behavior, decision, and social reality. If that is true, the real battle is not between political correctness and whatever the opposite of it is, but it is between the values that what we call political correctness promotes and the opposite of those values. There's no way to be against political correctness without being against diversity, without being against women, without being against racial diversity, without being against Italians, without being against migrants. The only way to construct this position is to adopt the same perspective of cultural politics and depict political correctness as the abomination that it is not. Does this make sense? Does anyone have problems with political correctness?
I think you have a question.
I'm a professor too, so
Yes.
I do relate to what you're saying, especially when you're talking about indoctrinating grad students coming from Europe because of cultural circumstance. And I've been thinking about political correctness lately in the context of the country. And I do, before, even I did Spanish, so I was using the word negro very freely. And I had to explain to the students, and I was teaching, that was back in Temple where most of the students are black. But I felt like I didn't want to stop saying words that I say, even when I mentioned the color black. And I always had to explain something. And that was many years ago, but recently, I don't know why, I've been thinking about it, and I've realized that there's one thing about being in a classroom. You have to be very careful. Because now I'm more careful when I talk about these kind of things, or get into things that are a little bit controversial, or even politics. Because when we have, somehow we feel like we can, it's a band, it's a Haverford, students they should be able to handle it, right? But on the other hand, lately I've been thinking, they should, but in a way, in this context, we should be very careful because this is a position of power.
Absolutely.
And in that context, you have to be very careful. You have to be very politically correct because you cannot make a student feel intimidated or that they cannot or uncomfortable.
I think it's more to be aware of your position of power and not being considerate and not work to avoid unnecessary violence that comes from your position of power.
Yeah.
And I think that it is immoral to be a professor and not being aware of your position of power. So I think there is like a really forced, I think there's no way not to make this complicated and on our end, on the end of the professor.
I think there's a lot of ignorance. Like we think that everybody thinks the way we think.
Exactly. And that's
we assume that
problem.
everybody thinks the way we think because including in the department.
Oh yes.
In the humanities, where everybody assumes that everybody thinks the same way politically, and everybody's on the same train, and they're not.
And especially in departments related to European studies, where a lot of people were trained in extremely authoritative settings. In that place, there's no such a thing as a discussion class, seminar. Like in that place, there's only one person who speaks. It's not something that I despise. It's just a place where I wouldn't want to teach. Because now that I've seen this system, I prefer it. I don't say it's a better system, but I do prefer it personally. And when you are in a department that has a lot of people that are trained in that kind of environment, it's very hard. Because usually older people who owe a lot to this kind of training will resist the kind of change that I think moral and the times demand. And therefore will try to involve you in practices of abusing of your power that you don't agree with. And of course those people have power over you. I'm on tenure, yes,
exactly.
I'm on a tenure track, I have to respond to. I'm very lucky because I'm right now in a department in which my chair is someone that believes in the things that I believe on and is not authoritative, but that's not always the case. No, totally. But do we all? Yes.
Oh, actually, you should finish what you were going to say first.
No, I was.
Maybe it'll.
I was trying to have generative question, but since already there's a question from you.
Yes. Right. Yeah. So, it's so funny, the way that whether we call it the right or the anti-PC people, it's not particularly relevant whether they're right or left, but the anti-PC people think that political correctness is A, new, and B, limited to this sector of the left. When, of course, we had a handful of years ago, President Bush talking about enhanced interrogation. If that's not political correctness, I don't know what it is. It's the epitome of political correctness.
It's not political correctness.
Really? You think so?
It is cultural politics.
Okay, so you think it's a square rectangle phenomenon?
Political correctness, it's a specific, it depends on definitions, right? But there is a big thing that is cultural politics that lays on the assumption that language changes things. You can agree or disagree, right? If you agree, you do things like Bush calling torture enhanced interrogation, or calling bank accounts financial products, or calling, all these things. There's no, if you want to be outside of this, you must be, some sort of anarchist that lives in the woods. There's no way out of this. This is the truth. I believe very strongly. I don't want to impose this, but I do believe very strongly in the fact that language determines things. Now, within this, in the 70s, in the 60s and the 70s, specifically in universities, there were people that read the linguistics, the philosophy of language, that started saying, hey, if you change the name of things, people will more likely buy them or accept them as palatable, etc. These people started, hey, let's use this rhetoric for the good. Some of them were poets that started using the language of advertisement for doing concrete poetry, things like that. Some of them were filmmakers. Some of them were professors who started saying, okay, let's have a regulation that says that we can never use this word, like that we can never call adult women girls. And not because they're not girls in the mind of some, that doesn't matter, because truth is what we make through language, right?
Right.
And so let's adopt this language. And that has been labeled, that specific form of cultural politics, that is a cultural politics adopted in non-national contexts, in which there is a community that can agree on some values for an embetterment of that community along the lines of the values that it has changed. That is what it was originally. It was called political correctness by, for instance, lesbian radicals to mock each other. It was as a joke. I was like, it's not very politically correct. I have bibliography on this that I can share with you all later. It was used by leftists to talk about communist dogma. I know that this is not really politically correct of me in the sense it's not Stalinist, but American communists, I'm saying. It was then adopted by what we today call right wing, which I think is also it's also a cultural politics, but it's not the right wing, to label that kind of institutional and collective behavior as a negative thing that is risky. Okay. So calling, euphemism political correctness, it's wrong. We have to decide first if we reclaim the term politically correct as a serious and positive thing, which is what I do, especially when I go back to Italy and I try to tell people or to write on newspapers that we really need more political correctness in Italy, if anything, not less. The general discourse in Italy is like less. We don't need this American influence. Or on the other hand, we can also reject it and say, political correctness is something that has been used as a derogatory term for progressive cultural politics in academia. Let's stop using this term and let's go back to the basics, which is progressive political cultural politics in academia. Okay.
Yes. Yes. Let me gather my thoughts for a second. Right. I agree with pretty much everything you said. I was just focusing on the sort of Hegelian idea of this kind of like social consensus. The problem I see with political correctness as we see it in the university is not necessarily the degree to which it has gone so far in saying, for instance, undocumented persons instead of illegal alien. But rather the attitude which people take towards this moral standard. So let me explain. So I'm going to make another Hegelian point, that every truly complete system has the incipient element of incompletion, of paradox, of negation, that can erupt from the system as it evolves dialectically. So what I'm saying is that even if we can enforce these moral standards through this kind of cultural consensus, constant intersubjectivity, constant dialogue, etc., etc., there needs to be like some rare case where you can question the status of using this particular set of politically correct terminologies, or going in, so far. Maybe you've gone too far. Maybe you haven't gone far enough in limiting language, because limiting language is inherently dangerous if you take the Worfian hypothesis, and that what the modern, I'm going to call it academic left, maybe progressive activist left is better. I'll call you progressive activist left, has done is have taken this Platonic approach of trying to arrest social change, just have the reign of the philosopher king of third wave intersectional feminist philosophy. I'm not going to criticize it in itself. I'm just saying that they've taken it as God to prevent the incipient element of change that is inherent in social process from taking over when it needs to. Maybe it doesn't need to, but from ever preventing it from germinating if it needs to, as circumstances change, and allowing the culture to evolve. So they've decided to make the life of culture a stagnant thing, whereas as people like Hegel, Heidegger, so many other people tell us, consciousness is essentially temporal, is essentially evolving in time. It needs to be given the space to evolve. So I'd like to see what you think about that.
Absolutely. You're giving me, what you're saying is an argument for political correctness and for what you call left progressive academic agenda. The only other, first of all, when you say limiting language, that's not what cultural politics does. It's not limiting language. It's first being aware that language produces consequences, change, etc. The Worfian hypothesis. And once you do that, it's controlling your words. It's about not claiming irresponsibility, lack of responsibility, ignorance, ingenuity, simplicity, when you're actually performing acts of violence through your language. Saying illegal is an act of violence in the Worfian hypothesis, right? If we want to deny the Worfian hypothesis, we have to do a completely different discussion, right? But assuming that language does what it does, it's not a matter of limiting language, it's a matter of limiting violence. Does it make sense? Am I responding to what you're saying?
You're certainly responding. I just
because the thing is,
right,
Platonic.
Sorry, you should finish your thought about Plato.
Your argument against this, or that challenges this, is, if I'm correct, what's the absolute truth from which all the words should descend, right?
Okay.
Is it?
Sorry, I don't get quite what you mean by that phrase.
Is the problem that you see, that you described in your question, that there shouldn't be some sort of absolute world of ideas from which the words should descend in reality, in our language?
Something more like that one. It's more of a Nietzschean critique, I suppose.
Yes.
You can make a Hegelian argument for that. That morality language,
evolves.
Right, evolves and has to evolve, and that arresting social change can only do harm and is against human nature, and human nature will rebel like mad to resist it.
I agree completely, and I think that language should evolve along with morality.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
That's it.
Yeah, I can't. And this is something I haven't thought through very well. This is just more so my, American liberal, free speech is amazing, words can't hurt you attitude, that calling, let's say, using the term illegal is an act of violence. It's a premise that doesn't gel in my head. It's a premise that, if taken to the logical extreme, goes way too far and demands that you quash the incipient element and destroy culture. But this is not something I've thought through very well by any means, and I can easily be convinced otherwise.
Neither did I. Okay, so I realize the problem of saying that language is violence, because violence can be illegal.
Yeah.
While language cannot be parts of language can.
Okay.
So that's the problem. But at the same time, I think that the equation is not that they're the same thing, but that they produce the same results. And therefore, being aware of that, you should refrain from committing acts of linguistic violence.
Okay, I see. Okay,
tomorrow.
Yeah. No, I'm.
Then it becomes institutional when the institution itself gives itself values. Right? So if Bryn Mawr, as I read when I came here now, is about things like it's a typical thing that comes from the problem of political correctness, the way it was handled by American justice. Bryn Mawr says, at Bryn Mawr, diversity is a resource for better pedagogical experiences. If it is so, then you have to sanction somehow the use of language that denies this value. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Within a community, that is why political correctness is specifically strong. It was born in universities, and in universities it should be held at the maximum respect, because it's a way of living social language that is very high and demands a lot of attention. So it's something that you can do for 4 years, and when you're reading a lot of stuff. Then I realized that it becomes, but the good thing about adopting something very strongly in universities that cannot be adopted as a national law or state law is that then this brings the change out of the universities and in society in positive ways. That's the power of education, right? Yes.
I see. So the change is that we need to, because I see a problem, not with the use of the word violence, because I think it comes from the technical postmodern text, right? Just with people's reaction to when they read the word violence, and they think violence the same way that my bludgeoning someone in the street is violence. It's a different kind of violence, maybe we should use a different term, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is that language, even if it doesn't do harm now, could or will do harm in the future, et cetera, et cetera. And so we should just be conscious about the language we use, but that it's, okay, I understand.
And you see that semantics is not just semantics. No? This is still always the same argument, the overall argument, which is language does things. No? Which is not a postmodern idea. It's a 19th century idea that was that determined postmodernism in many ways, but it's the idea behind the myth of Orpheus. No? So it's a very strong Western. It's a root of Western civilization, I believe. And if it is true, then violence is not just giving a punch in the street. Violence means something. It means violating something. It has a root. It has a history. It's a word that means something. Okay. Did I see you raising your hand? Joe?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
Go ahead.
And then,
no, please.
shall we go?
About the violence, I was wondering if even if we do accept the premise that their speech or words do have a violent impact, I was wondering why we're not making distinctions, like gradations about different scales of impact that you could have, like different words could have different scales of impact, say using a racial slur versus, I don't know, no examples popping in my head right now, but, and the trade-offs that you get for using that language, the discussion that you might produce might be worth it in one case and not in the other. So political correctness might well be extremely useful in a certain set of circumstances, but not universally all the time.
I agree completely. I don't think that political correctness is some sort of like moral law that transcends contexts. Because this is still a linguistic argument. And language is, in my opinion, language is not the grid in which reality exists. No? Language is a relational tool that happens in communities. It's related to the people that it only exists in the people that use it. No? So the only way, like, political correctness is very effective in groups. It cannot be a law because of this, because it doesn't reside in a Platonic hyperuranium. It resides in the practice of talking among specific individuals that agree on specific things. I do believe that Italy will get better, that Italian universities, that Italian schools, like we have an amazing public system that is free for everyone, and in which everyone studies the same thing. Every single person I know from Italy has read the Iliad and the Odyssey, for sure. Has read the Aeneid in Latin. Now, it's a cool system that really works. In this system that was born, non-denominal, public, etc., with a very strong idea of what the canon is and what you should know. Now they're putting nativities in every school in some cities because it's perceived as, because the Lega Nord, this party of identitarian politics, believes that that's the way in which we should spread our national values. I think it's great. I think it's absolutely crazy. My mother doesn't. My mother, a liberal woman from the left, she doesn't because she's not here. She doesn't see how a nativity, which is language, can be harmful to anyone. So I do think that it's a matter of awareness and it's a matter of community. It's effective in some spaces, and it's infective in the sense that when you realize the awareness that you gain in a context like a university can be translated into action elsewhere and can affect other communities. And I think that it promotes goodness, it promotes embetterment. And of course I understand that you can be against this. You can say, no, actually, I'm all for nativities or racial slurs because I believe in it. I'm a racist. You can be a racist, but you cannot be anti-racist and at the same time for racial slurs. This is what I think. Rolando.
Alessandro, grazie.
There you go.
So I'm a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist.
That's really cool.
So, language. I was born and raised in Mexico, and I can speak English, proficiently because interactions are all about the language, right? So I had to emphasize that. And one of the dictums of psychotherapy is that you can say anything at any time. We have to know how, right? And this you can do most impactfully. And imagine the position of authority that you have. If you're the therapist, and, the person across you comes, with pain and suffering, trying to find some relief. So the idea is that you can say anything at any time. You just have to find how, which is the language side. It has, some sort of overlaid elements of cultural awareness, right? But the point that I'm going to is that if it is true, as I have experienced it professionally, you can say anything, you can discuss anything, you can allow an environment in which the patient can have any fantasy or can confess any sin or any atrocity, right? You have to work, through it. That seems like a free system in which work can get accomplished. I think that the way that I understand political correctness is where it is not just that some words are sanctioned as necessarily toxic. You can argue with that, but the problem is that as you extract words that actually meant something and were created because they served a function, you're also extracting options, possibilities, ideas that could be discussed and maybe need to be discussed. So where I have a visceral reaction against political correctness and its opposite is this sort of prohibition of
banalization.
Yeah, going into certain ideas, certain thoughts that just like my patient confesses a sin, I don't need to judge. Let's get into it. But I think that's where this struggle sort of deprives everyone from dealing with issues that are very human. Like finding somebody that's not like you, either better or worse. You should be worse. And you're not being able to discuss and work through that. So I'm glad that you're taking this topic. And I say all this, but this might be your background, Alessandro, that you were very much coming from the from the language point of view, and I was missing the other aspects of sort of working through societal problems or interpersonal problems or things like that. You were leaving me thinking that you would only need to be more astute at what which words you use, and you could be inflicting in the other person the same violence that more crass words would. That other more sophisticated oppressors, would know not to use.
You can be mean, right?
Oh,
you can be mean,
right?
But nobody's worried about the freedom. That nobody is worried about whether or not being mean limits the freedom of anyone.
Yeah,
that's the thing. You can be astutely evil and making people feel inferior or using your authority. But that's a kind of aggression that is much less ambiguous than the pure.
It's more about the cultural stereotypes, right? Like the legal alien, for instance.
For instance, it's about minimal units of language that become problematic and that are not inherently problematic, because of course when you say negro in Spanish, it's not problematic inherently, but it becomes in a specific context, of course. While being mean, whatever language, it's not about that. Being using your power to make people uncomfortable, etc. That's a different order of problem. It's not cultural politics. It is in a way, but it's not specifically that. But prescriptive is I think that a huge problem is the banalization of cultural politics, not just from the point of view of Trump, who says political correctness is a stupid thing that makes us waste time. He said, no, it's a waste of time, and this country doesn't have the time for it. This is a form of banalization and demonization.
Right.
They will not let you say Merry Christmas. They will stop you from this. This is an attempt at canceling Christmas. This is a form of banalization. But there is another form of banalization, that is people that do believe that they are enforcing political correctness by saying, let's ban this word. That's not cultural politics. That's not how cultural politics works. And this is where all of this started. Like conversation with Matthew, I was telling him, when you find people in your daily experience of college that try to do exactly this infuriating thing of saying yellow from today is banned forever. No? Tell them this is not cultural politics. This is not how it works. It's all about awareness. It's all about awareness. It's all about awareness and consensus and practices of social relation, rather than on prescription. Prescriptivism is problematic, always, of course. But at the same time, the contrary of prescriptivism is not whatever you do, whatever you want, whatever goes, anything goes, right? See.
Right, just to, oh man, I can't call you Rolando. He's my dad, I can't. Just
You can call me Dr. Rolando.
It's actually a great practice to call. I started calling my parents by first name. It's I think you know more than me why. This is a very interesting. I come from Italy. You're not supposed to leave your families until you're 40, so it's
right. No, I'm 20, so maybe when I turn 21 and I've reached the pinnacle of legal adulthood,
then you can.
Then I can call him. Yeah. So my sympathy for his point is that maybe you'll say that this isn't cultural politics, but I think it would be in the realm of cultural politics. Is that what he's saying is that there are some human issues that need to be discussed because this is the nature of the human condition. There are a bunch of philosophies that discuss that, and that I don't want to say not the banalization, the banning of certain words, but the fact that maybe there's a cultural problem. The language is epiphenomenal, but the inability to use certain words, like he says, limits the possibility. For instance, Victorian England, there's a story that the reason that we call parts of the chicken white meat and dark meat is because the Victorians were too prudish to say breast and thigh.
Sure.
And so those kinds of things.
Why do you say they were too prudish?
Prudish? Mm-hmm. For a bunch of. You think this is an important point that I make?
Yeah.
Or okay, maybe I'll go back to that at the end.
Okay.
But in any case, my point is that these things, and maybe the language is epic phenomenal. Although if we follow the Whorfian hypothesis, we need to, pay a little more attention. Is that this sections off parts of the human experience and says no, and we do this today in this society with lots of things. I don't think I need to give examples, and that this isn't a danger in which we tell the naive college, the snowflakes, that hey, political correctness is limiting free thought, and look at Locke, look at Milia. No, but the point is that some cultural processes. What if some cultural processes that limit certain parts of the language, before language can catch up to open up these new domains of human experience? Because, for instance, when you make certain words banal, like the word awesome, doesn't mean anything anymore. Mm-hmm. Other words take up a new role, like awe-inspiring or something. Mm-hmm. And it's a constant dialectic. So even if you forbid things, language catches up. But what if what we are doing, or what has been done, is sectioning off certain parts of language, and it's not even forbidden, it's just, context, relational, I feel bad when I say these things, faster than language can catch up to be able to discuss these human experiences efficiently.
Have you ever studied linguistics?
No.
You should. You love it. The history of language shows you that what you call the evolution of language, it's something that is very easy to study, because it's amazing. In fact, it started all the philosophy of the 20th century. I'm a Swiss guy studying the origin of words. There's not a difference between what you described as an artificial change, an artificial.
Oh, I should clarify. This sectioning off is not artificial.
Okay.
By any means, the Platonic hegemony is, but I'm still worried about the state of the culture, even if it is organic and natural. And this is where Hegel isn't enough, because sometimes culture goes wrong and you get Hitler.
Language evolves exactly because we decide to change things. There's not like a natural evolution of language in which sometimes there are authoritative interventions. Language is, the history of language is this history of this kind of choices that produces cultural effect. There's not some sort of natural evolution of culture and of language that we can somehow alter with our arrogance. of, aware people. There's no way. That's not how it works. The evolution of culture is related to decisions that people take. And that's it. Language changes because authors start using a word, or because a word suddenly becomes problematic or becomes too used. There's not such a thing as language catching up on culture. The Victorian thing that you described also is very interesting, because it shows, like, if you look at Victorians as prudish people, you're having a perspective from here on them is undermined. You're saying, yeah, these stupid Victorians. They didn't realize that you can say breasts because it's actually normal. It's a very biased look at the past.
No,
it's very problematic.
Right. This is the.
It's very non-Nietzsche.
No, it's not.
Far away.
No, yeah, because Foucault would mock me and Toro was following Nietzsche. Yeah. Although,
and also, if I may, the people that stigmatized that kind of language are exactly the people who invented what we call political correctness. Feminists in the 60s and the 70s that said, look at what Victorian age did to sex. Look at the social consequences of this for people like me. Let's not do that. Let's talk about breasts. Let's not infantilize women by calling them girls. Let's not turn everything into a Victorian vignette.
The problem is the culture, not the state of the language. So it's the culture not wanting to talk about certain things that is the heart of the issue, which we can influence through decision in the language.
There's not such a thing as a culture that is shared before we adopt language that turns practices into culture. People are not prudish inside because it's the 19th century and so there is this prudence around that make them prudish and they don't know what to say, and then arrives, Charles Dickens and say dark meat instead of breast. It's all connatural, it's the same thing. It's the language that determines, that disseminates a culture, that produces the culture itself. It can be prescriptive in a law way, like for instance, in fascist Italy, use like the word laws. There are like pieces of paper with like, you have to say this around, that disseminated very quickly culture. There are a million other ways, literature, art, public speaking, this kind of the Bible, translations of the Bible, things like that disseminate linguistic practices, that disseminate culture. Then we look at it from now, look at it, read these words, and try to think the way they thought. Right?
Yeah, in this regard, I'm just an inauthentic post-structuralist. I think there's a bedrock bottom sphere of human social relations. I don't want to say it's the best one, but it's one that at least doesn't limit us such that society ossifies and crumbles. So in this regard, I can't get fully on board with the post-structuralist relativism.
But, yeah.
I've said too much, though.
Sure. I just want a footnote, which is I hate post-structuralism.
Really?
Of course, I'm an Italianist. But at the same time, there's no way out.
Yeah, no,
I'm nostalgic. I'm embarrassingly nostalgic. I want to live in the past. I watch Mad Men, But
yeah, you can't.
But not really, because there's no way out. There's only a forward. Post-structuralists are the best readers of my heroes, of philosophers before. I love Hegel because I can read it through the eyes of Canalonzi and makes it correct, makes it today. This is another discourse though. Matthew.
Joe, do you want to go?
No, I want Matthew. Can I have Matthew?
You can.
Okay. All right. I'm probably going to put my discourse at a different level as Alex's, as it always seems. Probably a level below.
He's being modest.
Yes, I'm being too crude, as I always am. But sort of one of the things, and this is where I sort of get, one of the things you mentioned, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, considering I talked about this with Joe yesterday, after a different conversation, is that this is where I go into my spiel, where I make an observation that clearly has bias, but I'm going to try to present it in a way that is at least somewhat open to change. because obviously I'm coming in with my preconceptions, but I also don't necessarily want that to close off discussion. Speaking of closing off discussion, one of the things that I sort of find that I really personally struggle with, and that really it becomes problematic when I think about it, is the idea that, and we just had this talk on sort of things that are spiritual and religious and all of that, is that certain things, in a very paradoxical way, in, I guess let's call it progressive cultural politics, become, in the name of sort of taking these sacred things, in the name of deconstructing sacred things, it makes other things sacred or untouchable. For example, you mentioned, and this is, I made basically the exact opposite point to Joe yesterday, was that you cannot be anti-racist and anti-political correctness, or that you cannot, because what I do, and sort of, I think personally, or you cannot be, it's sort of certain things become immune from criticism. And what I personally struggle with a lot, well, partly because I am a progressive, but at the same time I have a lot of problems with what I used to call political correctness, what I think sort of I might more properly be termed progressive cultural politics, is...
So you're a progressive, or you're against progressive cultural politics?
In some
censorious
senses.
impulse, right?
In some senses, again. It's sort of... sometimes I say I'm a Democrat with a Republican's mouth, just because that's sort of that's sort of very paradoxical. But sort of, and one way that I sort of think about it is, and this is something that I actually wrote a paper on for one of my sociology classes, just putting it out there, is that there's this wonderful thing, and I used it for with the example of when people say, check your privilege, or especially check your white male privilege, is that in some ways, when people say that, at least in some of the contexts in which I've heard it, it's an attempt to render sacred a certain point of view and to sort of dismiss any criticism of an argument as racist, sexist, homophobic, bigoted, anti-progress, etc. And what I sort of go back to then is that instead of sort of as an alternative to sort of this rendering sacred of certain things, one thing that I go back to, getting back to social theory, is this concept brought up actually by Jürgen Habermas called the criticizable validity claim, which he wrote in one of the few languages I actually cannot understand reading. Sorry. That came out very badly. I'm sorry. But, because I read the English translation, so I'm not sure exactly what the term is. My point being, I wasn't sure exactly how the term was actually in the original language. But, and it's this really interesting point that sort of for things to be moved forward in a society, you have to make a point which can be examined critically. And so I'm always sort of, I don't know, I personally always feel like I get rubbed the wrong way when anybody on any side. I feel this way when people say you can't, when people on the right say you shouldn't kneel for the anthem because it implies that there's something uncriticizable about the American flag. But I feel the same way, and again, probably because I'm in a college where as you say, sort of can be a breeding ground for this sort of progressive cultural politics value, that I sort of see it more so with things that tend to be pro-egalitarian, but I don't know. Sorry, I sort of am rambling at this point, so I'm going to stop. But I just wanted to sort of express my personal struggles with this sort of rendering sacred of certain points of view, which in a very ironic sense, because it renders certain things sacred in order to deconstruct things that used to be considered sacred. It gets very paradoxical and very ironic, I think, very quickly.
Yeah, then are they not inauthentic post-structuralists, these people?
Wow, that would be sort of, I guess.
So, ciao Sophie.
Ciao.
You didn't speak at all.
I know, I have to get Hanukkah candles before my Hanukkah party.
That makes
in an
sense.
hour. Very
All right, thank you for
Ciao, have
coming.
a good night.
Thank you.
So, there are a few things. One is, I don't think you have a problem with political correctness. Two, do you check your male privilege? Are you aware, or do you think you are aware of your male white privilege? Or do you reject the idea that you have such a thing, that you are provided with such a thing? Because this changes the kind of...
Personally, we can talk about the extent to which I would argue it exists. Do I believe white male privilege, male privilege, those sort of things exist? Yes.
Okay.
To be simplistic.
So, I see the problem of reducing everything to male white privilege. At the same time, I don't see, like, you have very bad interlocutors that don't so basically your argument here is that your interlocutors fail at recognizing that you are already aware of your white man privilege. Is that so? Because I want to avoid, the problem is, if the problem is this, it's a simple problem of, it's a contingent problem related to situations, to people that banalize what white privilege is, and that put problems of disparity in the middle of, discussion about coffee, doesn't make sense, etc. But if this is not the case, and it's a general problem, I don't understand what is it that you have a problem with. If you have a problem with the fact that when you deconstruct sacred things, those things are replaced by something, you have a problem with the practice of deconstruction itself. And if so, basically, you are defending what has been sacred throughout the age of humanism, which is an available position, but it's not a progressive position. It's a conservative position.
It seems like a fallacy, though, to correlate the saying that things which are sacred to certain people should be able to be criticized, correlating that with actually criticizing it yourself is the fallacy, because there's this one universal principle that you should be able to criticize anything that's separate from your criticizing the thing which other people are calling sacred.
But I don't think anybody's who said that you should be able to criticize anything. I don't read the
Constitution.
Yeah, of course you can criticize anything, and I can respond, check your white male privilege, and you shouldn't be worried about it. No, so we're not talking about that.
Well,
freedom of speech is not into question.
You were talking about how, in the United States,
You mean like the totalitarian Platonic impulse to be like, no, shame on you. Or even in cases like Britain's moving towards legal consequences for some of these things, these ideas that can't be criticized, right?
Well, I guess so, but that's not fundamentally what I want to talk about. You were saying, in the United States it's great because all of the presuppositions, you can criticize